There is always one chair that tells the whole story, the old janitor whispered as he straightened the tablecloths before the guests arrived. By the end of the evening, nobody would remember the speeches. Nobody would remember the decorations. But everyone would remember that chair. The Veterans Banquet Hall in Dallas glowed beneath rows of crystal chandeliers, their warm light reflecting from polished wooden floors and neatly arranged tables. Outside, a spring rain tapped softly against the tall windows, painting silver streaks across the glass. Inside, laughter and conversation drifted through the room as guests arrived in pressed uniforms, dark suits, and evening dresses. Some reunited with old friends. Some shared stories from years long gone. Others simply enjoyed being surrounded by people who understood service and sacrifice. Near the center of the hall, every table filled quickly. Handshakes turned into conversations. Conversations turned into smiles. Yet in the far corner, beside a wall lined with framed photographs of military history, one table remained nearly empty. Only a single woman sat there. Margaret Collins folded her hands neatly on the white tablecloth and watched the room come alive around her. At 74 years old, she carried herself with quiet dignity. Her silver hair rested gently against her shoulders. A navy blue cardigan covered a simple cream blouse. Her eyes moved calmly across the crowd, never lingering too long on anyone. Beside her sat an empty chair. Then another. Then another. Guests passed the table repeatedly. Some offered polite smiles. Others barely noticed her. A young couple approached once, glanced around, and chose another table closer to the stage. Margaret did not seem offended. She simply lowered her gaze and adjusted the small paper program resting in front of her. The chair beside her remained empty. As the evening continued, the emptiness became impossible to ignore. Every table in the ballroom grew louder and more crowded. Glasses clinked. Laughter echoed. Friends leaned closer to hear one another over the growing noise. Yet Margaret's table remained surrounded by silence. A server refilled her water and asked if anyone would be joining her. Margaret smiled gently and shook her head. "I do not think so," she said. The answer carried no bitterness. Only acceptance. Across the room, a large banner welcomed the evening's guest of honor. Volunteers adjusted decorations near the stage while organizers checked schedules and seating charts. Everyone was preparing for the arrival of a decorated Navy SEAL whose appearance had drawn guests from across the state. Excitement moved through the crowd. Phones appeared. Conversations shifted toward the upcoming presentation. Margaret listened quietly but never turned toward the stage. Instead, she looked at the empty chair beside her. For a moment, her expression softened. Almost as though she were remembering someone who should have been sitting there. Then the moment passed. She straightened her shoulders and offered a small smile to herself. Around her, the room continued celebrating. Nobody noticed the woman sitting alone. Nobody noticed the empty table in the corner. And nobody yet realized that before the night was over, that forgotten table would become the most important place in the entire building. The sound of applause arrived before the man himself. Conversations paused across the ballroom as heads turned toward the entrance. Event organizers straightened their jackets. Volunteers stepped aside. Guests reached for their phones. The honored guest had arrived. Commander Ryan Walker entered beneath the warm glow of the chandeliers with the steady confidence of someone accustomed to attention but never comfortable seeking it. Tall, broad-shouldered, and composed, he moved through the doorway with quiet professionalism rather than celebrity. Beside him walked Titan, a German Shepherd K9 whose sable coat seemed almost bronze beneath the golden lights. The dog moved with calm precision, neither distracted nor nervous, his amber eyes studying the room as carefully as any trained observer. A wave of admiration spread through the crowd. Several veterans stood to shake Ryan's hand. Others nodded respectfully. Children pointed excitedly toward Titan. Within moments, the entrance had become the center of the evening. Ryan. smiled politely as he greeted guests. He thanked an elderly Marine for his service. He stopped briefly to speak with a military family. He accepted handshakes, photographs, and congratulations with practiced humility. Yet through all the excitement, Titan remained unusually focused. The dog was not looking at the stage. He was not looking at the cameras. He seemed to be searching. Across the ballroom, Margaret Collins watched quietly from her nearly empty table. She observed the arrival with the same calm expression she had worn all evening. Unlike many guests, she did not pull out her phone. She did not move closer for a better view. She simply offered a faint smile before lowering her eyes to the folded program resting beside her plate. The empty chairs around her remained untouched. Near the stage, an event coordinator approached Ryan and pointed toward the podium. Everything was ready. The introductions would begin in only a few minutes. Ryan nodded. The schedule had been carefully planned. He adjusted his jacket and gently guided Titan toward the center aisle leading to the stage. For a moment, everything seemed perfectly normal. Then Titan slowed. His ears lifted. His head turned slightly toward the far corner of the room. Ryan noticed immediately. Years of working together had taught him to trust the dog's instincts. Titan rarely reacted without reason. The German Shepherd stopped completely. The leash tightened. Ryan followed the direction of the dog's gaze but saw only crowded tables, smiling guests, and distant decorations. "What is it, buddy?" he asked quietly. Titan did not move. His attention remained fixed. Around them, several people noticed the pause. Conversation softened. The event coordinator glanced at her watch, then back at Ryan. Titan took one slow step away from the aisle. Then another. He was no longer facing the stage. He was facing the far corner where Margaret sat alone beneath the framed photographs. Ryan frowned slightly. Something had captured the dog's attention with unusual certainty. The applause faded. The ballroom grew curious. And for the first time that evening, the forgotten table in the corner was no longer completely invisible. The entire ballroom seemed to pause with Titan. The German Shepherd stood motionless for several seconds, his gaze fixed on the far corner of the room where Margaret Collins sat alone. Ryan Walker felt the subtle tension in the leash and immediately understood that this was not ordinary curiosity. Titan had ignored crowded tables, decorated veterans, local officials, and honored guests. Whatever had captured his attention mattered to him. Around them, conversations faded into whispers. The event coordinator took a hesitant step forward. "Commander Walker, we are ready whenever you are," she said politely. Ryan nodded, but his eyes never left the dog. Titan began moving. Not quickly. Not excitedly. With purpose. The German Shepherd stepped away from the center aisle and started across the ballroom floor. Guests shifted in their seats to make room. Heads turned one after another as people followed his path. Ryan walked beside him, increasingly puzzled. Titan passed tables filled with retired officers. He passed donors seated near the stage. He passed men and women who had spent entire careers in uniform. Yet he never slowed. His destination remained fixed. Across the room, Margaret looked up as the dog approached. At first, she seemed surprised. Then something softer crossed her face. Recognition, perhaps. Or simply affection. Titan reached the table and stopped beside the empty chair nearest her. For a moment, he studied her quietly. The room fell completely silent. Margaret looked into the dog's amber eyes. Neither moved. Then Titan lowered himself into a perfect working posture beside her chair. Calm. Respectful. Certain. A murmur swept through the crowd. Several guests exchanged confused glances. Others leaned forward in their seats. One retired Marine quietly removed his glasses and stared. Even the event staff seemed unsure what to do next. Ryan stopped a few feet away. He had witnessed Titan detect medical emergencies, recognize emotional distress, and respond to subtle signals most people missed. But he had never seen the dog ignore an entire ballroom just to sit beside a stranger. Margaret slowly reached out one hand. Her fingers trembled slightly with age. Titan remained still as her hand rested gently against the fur behind his ears. The German Shepherd closed his eyes for a brief moment. The gesture looked less like an introduction and more like a reunion. Ryan felt a strange sensation settle in his chest. He could not explain it. Yet something about the scene felt important. The empty chairs around Margaret suddenly seemed different. The forgotten table no longer looked forgotten. It looked significant. As though the entire evening had quietly revolved around it from the beginning. Margaret smiled faintly and stroked Titan's neck. "You are a good dog," she whispered. Titan's ears lifted at the sound of her voice. Several people nearby heard her and smiled. Yet the curiosity throughout the room only deepened. Why had the dog chosen her? Why had he crossed an entire ballroom to reach someone nobody else had noticed? Ryan studied Margaret carefully for the first time. There was dignity in the way she sat. There was patience in her eyes. And there was something else. Something familiar. A feeling he could not quite place. The applause, the speeches, the schedule, all of it suddenly felt far away. Because standing beside that quiet table in the corner, Ryan began to suspect that the most important story in the room had not yet been told. Ryan Walker took a slow step closer to the table. The ballroom remained unusually quiet. Even the musicians near the stage had stopped adjusting their instruments. It seemed as though the entire room was waiting for someone to explain what Titan already appeared to know. Margaret Collins gently removed her hand from the dog's neck and folded it once more on the table. Her calm expression never changed, but Ryan noticed something in her eyes. It was not surprise. It was familiarity with being overlooked. The realization unsettled him more than he expected. Titan remained seated beside her chair, perfectly composed. The German Shepherd had no interest in returning to the stage. He had made his choice. Ryan glanced at the empty chairs surrounding Margaret. 4 seats. All vacant. Every other table in the ballroom was crowded with conversation and companionship. Yet, she sat alone beneath a row of framed military photographs that most guests had barely noticed. Ryan looked back at her. "Ma'am," he said respectfully, "would you mind if I sat here for a moment?" A faint ripple moved through the crowd. Several guests exchanged surprised looks. Margaret seemed equally surprised. Then she smiled softly. "Of course not." Ryan pulled out the empty chair beside her and sat down. The simple act changed the atmosphere of the room. The honored guest of the evening had abandoned the spotlight to sit beside the woman nobody else had chosen to join. Across the ballroom, people watched with growing curiosity. Ryan studied the photographs on the wall behind her. Most depicted service members from different eras. Some images were faded with age. Others showed younger faces smiling beside ships, aircraft, and military units. Then his attention returned to Margaret. "Have you attended this event before?" he asked. Margaret nodded. "Several times." Ryan glanced around. "Do you know many people here?" She looked at the crowded room for a moment before answering. "Not anymore." There was no self-pity in her voice. Only honesty. The answer lingered between them. Ryan noticed a small pin attached to the collar of her cardigan. It was old. Worn smooth by time. Most people would never have recognized it. But Ryan had spent enough years around military communities to know it was not decorative. He leaned slightly forward. "That is an interesting pin." Margaret looked down at it and smiled. "It has been with me for a very long time." Before Ryan could ask another question, Titan suddenly lifted his head and looked directly at the pin. The dog's attention sharpened immediately. Ryan followed his gaze. Something about the tiny object seemed important. A memory stirred somewhere deep in his mind. A story from years ago. A name mentioned by his father during a conversation he had nearly forgotten. He could not quite reach it. Not yet. Margaret noticed the change in his expression. "You seem to remember something," she said gently. Ryan nodded slowly. "Maybe." Around them, the room remained silent. The empty table that nobody wanted had become the center of attention. And as Ryan looked at the small pin resting against Margaret's collar, he felt the first unmistakable hint that her story was far larger than anyone in the ballroom imagined. Ryan could not take his eyes off the small pin. It was simple, almost unremarkable, the sort of item most people would overlook without a second glance. Yet the longer he looked at it, the stronger the feeling became. Somewhere in his memory, that symbol had existed before. Somewhere in a conversation from years ago. Titan remained beside Margaret Collins, calm and attentive, as though he already understood what Ryan was struggling to remember. The ballroom waited in silence. Margaret noticed the distant look in Ryan's eyes and smiled gently. "My father used to do that," she said. He would stare at something and disappear into a memory. Ryan laughed softly. "I think I inherited the habit." Margaret nodded. "It usually means something important is trying to find its way back." Her words settled over him. Then, like a light turning on in a dark room, the memory arrived. He was 16 years old again, sitting at a kitchen table while his father sorted through old photographs and documents. One picture had fallen from a folder onto the floor. Ryan remembered picking it up. A group of Navy personnel stood together in front of a communications center. Most faces were unfamiliar. But one woman had been marked with a small circle drawn in blue ink. His father had pointed to her and said, "If you ever hear that name, remember it." Ryan had asked why. His father had leaned back in his chair and smiled. "Because some people save lives without anyone ever knowing they were there." Ryan looked at Margaret. His pulse quickened. "I think my father talked about someone like you." The room grew even quieter. Margaret lowered her eyes for a moment. "A lot of years have passed." Ryan nodded. "Did you work in naval intelligence?" Several guests gasped softly. Margaret looked genuinely surprised. "Yes." The answer hung in the air. Ryan felt every piece sliding into place. "My father served aboard the USS Hartford in the early 1980s. Margaret's eyes widened slightly. "Robert Walker?" Ryan shook his head. "His younger brother. James Walker." For the first time all evening, emotion broke through Margaret's calm composure. She placed one hand over her heart. "James," she whispered. "I remember James." Ryan felt a lump rise in his throat. "He used to tell me there was a woman who prevented disasters before anyone else even knew danger existed." Margaret looked down at the table. "Your father was kind. He never forgot you." The words seemed to strike something deep inside her. For several seconds she could not speak. Around them, guests listened with growing fascination. The woman sitting alone at the forgotten table was no longer just another attendee. She was becoming a living connection to stories, sacrifices, and memories that had quietly shaped other lives. Titan rested his head against Margaret's knee. She gently touched his fur and smiled through moist eyes. Across the ballroom, people began looking at her differently. Not with pity. Not with curiosity alone. But with the first signs of genuine respect. And for the first time that evening, the empty chairs surrounding Margaret Collins no longer seemed destined to remain empty for much longer. Margaret Collins looked around the ballroom as though she had suddenly awakened inside someone else's memory. The attention felt unfamiliar. For most of the evening she had been invisible. Now dozens of eyes rested on her. Yet what touched her most was not the curiosity. It was the kindness beginning to appear behind it. Ryan Walker remained seated beside her while Titan rested quietly at her feet. The German shepherd seemed completely content, as if he had accomplished the task he set out to do the moment he entered the room. Margaret gently ran her fingers through the fur along his neck. "He reminds me of someone," she said softly. Ryan smiled. "Who?" Margaret looked toward the rain-speckled windows. "People I served with." Ryan laughed quietly. "That is not usually the comparison people make." "No," she replied. "But loyalty has the same look no matter what form it takes." The answer lingered in the air. Around them, guests listened carefully. Nobody seemed interested in returning to their conversations. Nobody appeared concerned about the delayed schedule anymore. The evening had become something different. Margaret folded her hands together and stared at the empty chairs surrounding the table. "You know," she said, "there was a time when these events felt very different." Ryan listened. "When my husband was alive, he sat right there." She pointed to the chair beside her. "Every year." Her eyes moved to another chair. "My daughter used to sit there before she moved across the country." Then another chair. "And friends. People I worked with. People who understood the stories without needing them explained." The ballroom remained silent. Margaret smiled faintly. Then little by little, life happened. Outside, rain drifted down the windows in silver lines. Inside, the chandeliers painted warm reflections across the polished floor. "My husband passed away 15 years ago," she continued. "My daughter built a wonderful life in Oregon. We speak often, but distance has a way of making rooms feel larger." She paused. "Friends grow older. Some move away. Some leave this world." Ryan lowered his eyes respectfully. Margaret's voice never trembled. Yet every word carried the quiet weight of truth. "One day you wake up and discover that most of the people who shared your memories are gone." Several veterans around the room nodded almost imperceptibly. They understood. Perhaps more than anyone. "The strange thing," Margaret said, "is that loneliness does not arrive all at once. It arrives one empty chair at a time." The sentence settled across the ballroom like a prayer. Even the event staff stood motionless. Ryan felt something tighten in his chest. He glanced at the empty seats around the table and suddenly saw them differently. They were no longer pieces of furniture. They were absences. They were chapters. They were years. Titan lifted his head and gently rested it against Margaret's knee once more. A small smile appeared on her face. "That is why tonight means more than you realize," she whispered. "Not because anyone remembered my name." She looked around the room. "Because for the first time in a very long time, I do not feel like I am sitting alone." Ryan sat quietly for several moments after Margaret finished speaking. The words about loneliness lingered in the ballroom long after they were spoken. Nobody rushed to fill the silence. Some truths deserved room to breathe. Titan remained beside Margaret's chair, his head resting comfortably against her knee, while the soft rain continued tracing patterns across the tall windows beyond the crowded hall. Ryan looked around the room and realized something remarkable had happened. Hundreds of people had come to hear his story. Yet now every person seemed far more interested in hers. He smiled at the thought. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and carefully removed a folded piece of paper. The edges were worn from years of being opened and closed. He stared at it for a moment before speaking. "There is something I never told anyone about tonight," he said. Margaret looked at him with quiet curiosity. "What is that?" Ryan unfolded the paper. "My father carried this for almost 30 years. The crowd leaned closer. It was not an official document. It was not a commendation. It was a handwritten note, yellowed with age. Ryan held it carefully between his fingers. After he passed away, I found it inside one of his old boxes. Margaret's expression softened. What does it say? Ryan glanced down at the faded handwriting. It says, some people save your life once. Others save the future of your family without ever meeting them. Margaret blinked slowly. Ryan continued. Below that, he wrote a single name. He looked directly at her. Margaret Collins. A visible wave of emotion crossed the room. Several veterans lowered their eyes. Others sat perfectly still. Margaret stared at the note as if she were looking through time itself. I never knew he kept that, she whispered. Ryan nodded. Neither did I. He folded the paper again. When I was younger, I asked him why he talked about you with so much respect. Margaret remained silent. Ryan smiled faintly. He told me that some people stand in front of history, and everyone remembers their names. Then there are people who quietly hold history together behind the scenes. He said you were one of those people. Tears gathered in Margaret's eyes. She quickly looked away, embarrassed by the attention. But nobody in the room saw weakness. They saw humility. Ryan glanced around the ballroom. The truth is, I almost did not attend this event. A few surprised expressions appeared. My schedule was packed. I considered canceling. He laughed softly. My father would have never forgiven me. A few people smiled. Ryan looked down at Titan. Maybe that is why he brought me here. The German shepherd lifted his head as if responding to his name. Gentle laughter moved through the room. The tension eased, but the emotion remained. Then something unexpected happened. A retired Navy veteran from a nearby table stood and picked up his chair. Without saying a word, he carried it across the room and placed it beside Margaret's table. He sat down. Moments later, a military spouse did the same. Then another veteran. Then another. One by one, people began moving toward the table. Not because they were instructed to. Not because they felt obligated. Because they wanted to be there. And as Ryan watched the empty spaces slowly disappear, he realized the evening was becoming something his father would have treasured far more than any ceremony. It was becoming a reunion of gratitude. The movement toward Margaret Collins's table continued until it seemed as though the entire ballroom had forgotten where it was originally supposed to be. Chairs scraped softly across the polished floor. Conversations that had once filled separate corners of the room slowly gathered around a single place. What had begun with one retired veteran carrying a chair now became something larger than anyone expected. People were no longer watching Margaret from a distance. They wanted to sit beside her. They wanted to listen. They wanted to know the woman whose name had quietly lived inside the memories of so many others. Margaret looked around in disbelief as another chair appeared beside the table. Then another. A military spouse introduced herself and thanked Margaret for her years of service. A younger veteran asked if he could hear more about the people she had worked with. An elderly couple offered warm smiles and joined the growing circle. The empty spaces that had surrounded her all evening began disappearing one by one. Ryan Walker watched the transformation with quiet amazement. Earlier that night, nobody had chosen that table. Now there were not enough seats to hold everyone who wanted to be there. Titan remained close to Margaret, his head resting comfortably beside her chair, occasionally lifting his gaze toward the people gathering around them. The German shepherd seemed completely at ease, as though this outcome had been obvious from the beginning. Margaret laughed softly when someone brought over an extra dessert and insisted she take the first slice. The sound caught Ryan's attention immediately. It was different from the polite smiles she had offered earlier. This laughter carried warmth. It carried life. It sounded like someone remembering what it felt like to belong. Across the ballroom, event organizers exchanged emotional glances. The carefully planned schedule sat forgotten on a podium near the stage. Nobody seemed concerned. Nobody wanted to interrupt. Sometimes the most meaningful moments arrived without permission. The rain outside had nearly stopped. Through the tall windows, distant city lights shimmered against wet streets, turning the night into a sea of gold and silver reflections. Inside, the atmosphere felt lighter than it had all evening. Not louder. Just warmer. Margaret listened as people shared stories of family members who had served. She remembered names. She remembered places. To everyone's surprise, she recalled details from decades earlier with remarkable clarity. More than once, someone gasped when she remembered a parent or grandparent they had mentioned. Each memory seemed to build another bridge between the past and the present. Ryan noticed tears in the eyes of several guests. Not tears of sadness. Tears born from witnessing something rare. They were watching isolation give way to connection in real time. Then a man standing near the back slowly rose to his feet. He looked around the room before speaking. "I think we all came here tonight expecting to honor a hero." His voice carried across the ballroom. "Turns out we just had the wrong table." Gentle laughter moved through the crowd, followed immediately by applause. One person stood. Then another. Within moments, people throughout the ballroom rose from their chairs. Not because anyone instructed them to. Not because tradition required it. They stood because respect had finally caught up with the truth. Margaret covered her mouth as emotion overwhelmed her. The applause grew stronger. Ryan stood beside her. Titan rose as well. Surrounded by people who only hours earlier had been strangers, Margaret Collins looked around the room and realized something extraordinary. The loneliness she had carried through the door that evening was no longer sitting beside her. It had quietly slipped away, replaced by something she thought she might never find again. The applause continued for what felt like a long time, not because anyone planned it, but because nobody wanted the moment to end. Margaret Collins stood slowly from her chair, her hands trembling as she looked around the ballroom. Earlier that evening, she had walked through those same doors expecting another quiet night, another event where faces would blur together and memories would remain her only companions. Now the room before her felt completely different. The empty table that had greeted her at the beginning of the evening no longer existed. Every chair around it was occupied. Some people stood behind it because there was no more room to sit. Ryan Walker remained beside her, smiling with the quiet satisfaction of someone witnessing something larger than himself. Titan stood at Margaret's side, calm and proud, his amber eyes moving between the people gathered around them. The German shepherd seemed perfectly content simply being there. Margaret looked down at him and gently rested her hand on his head. "You knew before anyone else, did you not?" she whispered. Titan responded by leaning slightly closer. A few people laughed softly through their tears. The warmth in the room felt almost tangible now. One of the event organizers approached with a microphone, intending to finally begin the official program. Then she stopped. Looking around the room, she lowered it again. The planned speeches no longer seemed necessary. The most important message of the evening had already been delivered without a stage. Margaret glanced toward the chair where her husband would once have sat. For the first time in many years, the sight of that empty space did not hurt. Instead, it brought a smile. She imagined him watching somewhere beyond the reach of memory, amused by the unexpected turn of events. She imagined him saying exactly what he always said whenever life surprised them. "Keep your heart open. You never know what God might send through the next door." Her eyes filled again. Ryan noticed and gently placed a hand over hers. "My father would have loved this," he said quietly. Margaret nodded. "Your father always believed people mattered more than ceremonies." Ryan smiled. "That sounds exactly like him." Around them, conversations began flowing naturally. People exchanged stories. Phone numbers were shared. Old memories resurfaced. New friendships quietly formed. What had started as an evening honoring service had become an evening restoring connection. The rain outside had completely stopped. Through the tall windows, the city lights shimmered beneath a clear Texas sky. The storm had passed. So had something else. Margaret felt it as clearly as she felt the hand resting on Titan's head. The loneliness that had followed her for years was no longer sitting beside her. It had been replaced by laughter, conversation, and the simple comfort of belonging. Before the evening ended, Ryan raised a glass. The room gradually grew quiet once more. "Tonight," he said, looking toward Margaret, "we were reminded that some of the greatest people in our lives are not standing in the spotlight. Sometimes they are sitting quietly at a table, waiting to be seen." Every person in the ballroom rose to their feet again. Margaret smiled through tears as she looked at the faces surrounding her. Then, with Titan beside her and friends all around her, she realized something beautiful. She had not been rescued from loneliness. She had been welcomed home from it.